Listen. I am Mama Otomba, and I still remember the night Harlem itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the bricks of 125th Street were listening for something that did not belong to this world. And I tell you now, child, there are doors in this city that do not open with keys, but with memory, with blood, and with songs that were never meant to be finished. And this story begins with one such door, room 207. Above a jazz club where the saxophone used to cry like a wounded spirit every Friday night, until midnight struck and even the music seemed afraid to continue. And I was already an old woman, then sitting in my small apartment across the alley, grinding herbs in a wooden bowl my grandmother brought from the Gold Coast when I first heard about the disappearances musicians who entered room 207 and never returned the same or never returned at all. And Harlem in those days was alive with smoke and rhythm, with men in sharp suits and women in red lipstick, with racism sitting heavy outside the clubs like a second bouncer who never smiled. And yet inside those walls we built a kingdom of sound where pain could be disguised as melody. But room 207 did not belong to that kingdom. No, it belonged to something older, something that remembered Africa before ships and chains. Something that remembered desert winds speaking names no human tongue should carry. And the first man who warned me was a trumpet player named Elijah Graves, whose notes could make even broken glass feel like it was crying for redemption. And he came to my door shaking, saying, "Mama Otomba." I played last night, and the room answered me back in a voice that was not my own, and I laughed then, because men in Harlem often mistake fear for imagination. But his eyes told me he had seen something behind the sound, something that moved like a shadow but listened like a judge. And I told him, "Sit down and drink this tea," and he did. But before the steam even cooled, he whispered again that the door number had changed. When he wasn't looking from 207 to 207, that was not quite 207, as if the building itself was learning how to lie. And that was when I knew the ancestors were involved, because numbers do not shift unless something is rewriting the agreement between worlds. And I began to remember the stories my grandmother told me by firelight, of desert spirits that lived inside hollow places, waiting for rhythm to call them into form, and of jazz. Yes, child, jazz, being older than America itself, carried across oceans in bones that refused to forget, and I warned Elijah not to return. But musicians are stubborn when they believe a song is calling their name, so he went back that Friday night, and I followed at a distance, because I had already begun to feel the pull in my chest, like a drum being tightened too far. And the club below room 207 was packed, smoke thick as judgment, laughter sharp as broken glass, and the band was playing something new that night, something that did not belong to any sheet music I had ever seen. And every note seemed to climb upward toward that forbidden room like it was being pulled by invisible hands. And when midnight approached, the saxophone stopped mid-breath, and the silence that followed was not empty, but crowded, as if unseen bodies had taken seats in every corner. And I saw Elijah standing by the staircase, staring at the door marked 207, and it was no longer wood, but something like bone polished smooth. And he turned to me just once before he entered. And I swear, child, his lips formed a prayer in a language he had never learned. And then he was gone, and the music resumed downstairs, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better, because I could hear a second melody, now faint and wrong, playing above the first like a reflection that refused to match its source. And I climbed those stairs slowly, each step creaking, like it was remembering someone else's weight. And when I reached the door, I placed my palm on it and felt heat. Not fire, but something alive, something breathing in reverse. And I whispered the names of my ancestors, the ones who walked between drum beats, and the door opened without resistance, and inside room 207, there was no furniture, no walls as I understood them, only a vast shifting darkness filled with floating musical notes, like glowing insects. And in the center stood Elijah, but not as I knew him, his body stretched thin, like a shadow pulled too far from its source. And his trumpet was playing by itself, held by nothing. And the sound it made was not music, but instruction, as if it was teaching the room how to become a doorway. And then I saw it, child, the thing behind the sound. A presence wearing many faces at once, some African, some American, some not human at all stitched together by rhythm, and it spoke without words, pressing meaning directly into my bones, offering me knowledge in exchange for silence, offering me eternity in exchange for forgetting the living, and I understood then that room 207 was not a room at all, but a mouth feeding on performance, on emotion, on the desperation of musicians who believed they could outplay their fate. And Elijah was already halfway into becoming part of it, his eyes hollow but still crying sound, and I knew I had only one chance to anchor him back. So I began to sing. Not jazz, not church, but the old songs my grandmother taught me. The ones that call ancestors by name and demand their attention, and the room reacted violently, as if insulted the darkness, twisting the music, screaming, and the entity turned toward me fully for the first time. And I saw that it had no true face, only suggestions of faces like reflections in broken mirrors. And it tried to overwrite my song with its own, but my voice is older than this city, older than the buildings that pretend to own it. And I kept singing until the air itself began to fracture, and Elijah screamed not in pain, but recognition, as if he was remembering himself from a place far away. And I reached for him through the collapsing sound, pulling him back by his name, by his first breath, by every drum beat that ever carried his heartbeat. And for a moment I thought I had succeeded, because his hand moved, because his eyes blinked. But the room was not finished with him, and it offered one final bargain. A vision of Harlem, without suffering, without hunger, without chains, but also without music, and I understood that this was its true hunger, not souls but stories, and jazz was its favorite language of consumption. And I refused. And when I refused, the room shattered its own illusion, and Elijah fell forward into my arms as the door slammed shut behind us, and we were back in the hallway, the club still playing below, as if nothing had happened. But room 207 was now just a numbered door again, quiet, patient, waiting. And Elijah survived, but he never played trumpet again, because every time he tried the same note would appear in his music, the note that did not belong to this world. And I stayed in Harlem long after that night, watching musicians pass by that door, some curious, some afraid, some already hearing something calling them upward. And I tell you now, child, the room is still there, and it is still hungry. And sometimes when the city is quiet enough, I can hear it humming beneath the jazz, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to finish the song it began. And I tell you now, child, the room is still there, and it is still hungry. And sometimes when the city is quiet enough, I can hear it humming beneath the jazz, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to finish the song it began. And after that night with Elijah in my arms, I thought the worst had already shown itself, but Harlem does not reveal its deepest wound in a single cut. It lets it bleed slowly through the streets until even the air begins to smell like forgotten music, and I started to notice patterns. I could no longer ignore. Musicians, all connected to room 207, were not just disappearing or breaking. They were being selected, as if something inside that room was curating voices, the way a collector chooses rare instruments. And I began to ask questions in places where answers are usually buried under laughter and liquor. The club owner, a man called Silas Crow, who always wore white gloves even in summer, and spoke like every sentence was rehearsed in a courtroom, denied everything, of course, said room 207 was just storage, said musicians exaggerate when they drink too much, but I saw the way his eyes avoided the staircase, the way his fingers tightened whenever a trumpet note bent too long in the night air. And I knew he was not the source, but a keeper of the door, not the lock itself, but the hand that pretends not to hold the key. So I began to trace the history of the building. And Harlem in those days did not keep clean records for people like me to read easily. So I listened instead to the walls, to the elders, to the women, who remember things men try to forget it. And one name kept returning like a drum beat beneath conversation, a traveling musician from the South, who arrived decades earlier with nothing but a broken guitar and a fever in his voice. A man who played songs that made people dream of deserts they had never seen, and when I followed that thread deeper, it led me not north or south, but older, much older, beyond America, beyond slavery ships, into stories of a desert spirit that feeds on rhythm, a thing called in my grandmother's tongue, a listener without eyes, a presence that sleeps beneath silence and wakes when sound becomes devotion instead of expression. And I began to understand that room 207 was not built but opened, as if someone had once played a sequence of notes so precise that it tore a seam between worlds and never closed again, and I decided I had to see where that seam led. So I prepared my own working that night, laying salt from the Caribbean coast my aunt once carried in her pockets, burning camphor and cassava leaves. drawing protective signs on my floor in ashen chalk, while whispering to ancestors who do not always answer quickly, but never ignore persistence. And as I entered trance, I saw Harlem from above, not as streets, but as a living rhythm. And in that rhythm, room 207 pulsed like a blackened heartbeat, and behind it I saw something vast and patient, like a desert storm watching a village it has not yet touched. And I understood then that this entity did not come from Harlem at all. Harlem was simply where it learned to wear music as language. And I saw Elijah again in that vision, not as a victim, but as a thread being woven into something larger, his trumpet sound stretching backward through time, like a rope thrown into an ancient well, and I pulled on that thread with everything I had, calling his name into the space between worlds. And something answered me that was not him, but had learned him, mimicking his fear, his tone, his hope, and it offered me another vision, a city without grief, a Harlem, where no musician ever went hungry, where every note was rewarded with gold and applause that never ended, but beneath it all I heard the absence, the silence where human struggle should have been, and I realized this thing did not understand music the way we do. It understood only consumption, and I rejected it again, and when I did, the vision cracked like glass under pressure, and I fell back into my body, coughing ash and blood from my own lungs, and that is when I understood the cost of resistance. Because now it had noticed me fully, not just the musicians, not just Elijah, but me, Mama, Otomba. And from that night forward, the city began to shift in small ways, subtle at first. A saxophone note that lingered too long in the air even after the player stopped, reflections in windows that moved a fraction too late, strangers pausing outside the club as if hearing something calling them upward. And I realized the room was no longer waiting passively. It was learning patience through hunger, and Silas Crow came to my door one night, despite his pride, his white gloves trembling, as he asked me quietly what I had done. And I told him I did not open anything that was not already cracked, and he confessed then what I already knew. That room 207 had first appeared after a performance in 1923, when a traveling band played a song so powerful it made the audience forget to leave. Some say they are still sitting there, and I saw then the pattern of generations, how each era offers new musicians to the same listening thing. And I told him the only way to stop it was not to silence music, but to change its intent, to break the cycle of offering emotion as food. And he laughed bitterly, because men like him believe systems cannot be unmade, only managed. But I had already begun preparing something deeper, a counter-melody taught to me in dream by my grandmother. A song that does not open doors, but seals them from the inside. But to use it I needed something I did not yet have, a willing anchor from within the room itself, someone who had been touched but not fully consumed. And I knew Elijah was still that bridge, so I began to search for him in every place sound gathers after death, in subway echoes, in brass instruments, left in pawn shops, in the pauses between radio stations, until one night I heard him hoar, faint but real, trapped not inside the room anymore, but inside the music that now remembered him, and I followed that sound like a thread through rain and smoke back to the club where it all began. And I stood once more at the staircase, listening to room 207 hum beneath the building, like a sleeping beast pretending to be a memory, and I knew then that the final descent would not be physical but spiritual. But this time I would have to enter not as a witness, but as a counterforce, and as midnight approached again, the jazz below swelled louder than usual, as if the city itself was unaware. It was performing for something watching from above. And I placed my hand on the stairrail, feeling the vibration of trapped songs beneath the wood, and I whispered to every ancestor who ever crossed an ocean in silence, and I began to climb again, knowing fully that whatever waited beyond that door was no longer just listening for music, it was waiting for mine. And as I climbed those stairs again, I felt the building itself resisting me, not with force but with recognition, as if every plank and nail remembered the first time I tried to challenge what sleeps above. And the air grew thicker with each step, like sound itself was becoming a physical substance I had to push through, until I reached the landing where room 207 waited with its ordinary wooden door that now looked almost innocent, which is always how danger prefers to disguise itself when it believes it has already won, and I could hear it clearly now. Not music, but anticipation, a vibration like something enormous holding its breath, and beneath it faint and fractured Elijah's trumpet crying in fragments like a man trying to speak underwater. And I placed my palm on the door, and instead of heat, this time there was cold absolute and ancient, the kind of cold that does not belong to weather but to absence. And I whispered the counter-melody under my breath, the song my grandmother buried me, long before I understood its purpose. And the door did not open outward this time, it dissolved inward, like paper in water, and I stepped into room 207 again, but it was no longer a void of floating sound again. It had become a vast circular space, like the inside of a drum, and every surface pulsed with rhythm, as if the room itself had learned to breathe through percussion. And in the center stood Elijah. But now he was neither fully present nor fully gone, suspended in a lattice of sound threads that connected him to countless unseen players across time, and above him the entity hovered without form, only suggestion, wearing every note ever stolen from Harlem, and every desert wind my grandmother ever warned me about. And it spoke again without words, pressing into my mind the certainty that I was too late, that music belongs to those who can consume it without mercy. And I answered it aloud this time, because some things cannot be fought in silence, and I told it music is not food. It is memory, it is inheritance. It is the one thing even death cannot fully digest. And as I began to sing the counter-melody properly, the room reacted violently, the drum-like walls splitting into layers of collapsing sound, and every stolen note began to fracture, releasing faces, memories, names of musicians, long gone, who suddenly remembered themselves again, and Elijah's eyes flickered as if waking from a dream he had been forced to perform for too long, and the entity shifted for the first time, not attacking but recalibrating, as if it had never encountered refusal that carried structure instead of fear, and it tried to overwrite my song with the original hunger that built it, the desert rhythm older than cities, older than languages. But I had learned something in that moment that only ancestors teach when they are finally listening back, and I changed the rhythm inside my throat, not louder, but deeper, anchoring it to heartbeat instead of performance. And the room began to fracture along lines. It did not understand, because this thing could imitate music but not intention, and intention is what binds spirit to sound. And I reached for Elijah through the breaking lattice, and this time he moved toward me willingly, his trumpet dissolving as he moved, as if it had never belonged to him in the first place, and the entity surged in panic. Not anger but starvation, because it realized it was losing its composition, and it tried one last illusion, filling the room with applause, endless applause, promising recognition, immortality, every musician's oldest temptation. But I saw through it now, because applause is only silence pretending to be alive, and I kept singing the counter-melody until it no longer had edges, until it became pure structure without consumption. And when it reached its final resolution, the room collapsed inward like a lung, exhaling after holding breath for centuries, and there was a sound like a city forgetting a nightmare, and then nothing now. And I stood there holding Elijah as the space around us became ordinary wood and brick again, room 207 reduced to what it always should have been, a simple room with a simple door that no longer hummed with hunger. And Elijah fell to his knees, coughing as if his body was relearning how to be human instead of instrument. And when he looked at me, he did not speak for a long time, only touched the air as if confirming it was real. And I knew then that part of him would always remain tuned to something beyond this world, but it would no longer be controlled, only remembered. And I left him there with Silas Crow, who finally understood silence in a way his gloves could not protect him from, and I walked back into Harlem as the first light touched the rooftops. And for the first time in many nights the city sounded like itself again, imperfect, alive, grieving, joyful, human. And I tell you now, child, the room still exists, but it is only a room, no longer a mouth, no longer a mouth, no longer a listener without eyes. Because we gave it something it never understood, not silence and not sound, but meaning, and meaning is heavier than any hunger. And sometimes when I pass that building, I can still feel faint echoes like old musicians tuning their instruments in another life, but they do not pull anymore, they do not open anything. They only remind me that even the oldest darkness can be unmade when a voice refuses to become consumption, and that is why I am Mama Otomba, And that is why I still sing when Harlem sleeps, so nothing like room 207 ever learns my name again.